The Chicago-style hot dog has 7 official toppings. Ask a Chicagoan to name them, and they'll tick them off without hesitating. Yellow mustard, bright green relish, fresh onion, a dill pickle spear, tomato wedges, a shake of celery salt, and the 7th, a small, pale, softly pickled pepper nobody outside Chicago seems to know. That pepper is called a sport pepper. It's about the size of your thumb. And in Chicago, if you leave it off the hot dog, you haven't made a Chicago hot dog. You've made something else entirely. Here's the strange part. The sport pepper is not German. It's not Eastern European. It didn't come from the same immigrant world that produced the Vienna beef sausage. The pepper traces to the same southern Italian immigrant communities from Calabria and other regions of the Mezzogiorno that settled on Chicago's near west side. It crossed an ocean to land on a hot dog cart in a Depression-era Chicago street market. And somehow, it became the detail that separates an authentic Chicago dog from everything else. The cold explains the freshness of the toppings. The sausage explains the meat-packing city. But neither explains the sport pepper. For that, you need the story of Maxwell Street, and why Chicago's most chaotic, contested, immigrant-driven street market became the food laboratory that invented the most rule-bound regional hot dog in America. To understand why the sport pepper ended up here and not in any other American city, you need to see what Chicago was before it became famous for food. Chicago sits at the base of Lake Michigan, a natural terminus for the railroad lines pushing west from the East Coast and north from the south. 9 separate railroad companies converged on the city. In 1864, a consortium of those railroads paid $100,000 for 320 acres of Southside marshland. They broke ground in June 1865. By Christmas Day of that same year, the Union stockyards were open. The yards eventually held 2,300 separate livestock pens with room for 75,000 hogs, 21,000 cattle, and 22,000 sheep simultaneously. By 1900, they produced 82% of the domestic meat consumed across the entire United States. At peak employment in 1921, they put 40,000 people to work. Carl Sandburg didn't invent the phrase, "hog butcher for the world." He was simply being accurate. Maxwell Street first appeared on a Chicago city map in 1847. Named for Dr. Philip Maxwell, it began as a wooden plank road west from the Chicago River. Irish workers came first, brought in to build the railroads that made the stockyards possible. Greeks, Bohemians, Russians, Germans, Italians, and Poles followed. Then Eastern European Jews, whose presence shaped what the market sold. By 1912, the market occupied 9 square blocks centered at Maxwell and Halsted. 9 square blocks historians called the Ellis Island of the Midwest. But to understand why the sport pepper survived all of it, you have to follow one thread. And that thread begins far away, on the other side of an ocean. Calabria is the southernmost region of the Italian peninsula, a narrow strip of mountains and coastline pressed against the Mediterranean. By 19th century standards, it was poor even by southern Italian measures. Most families farmed plots too small to feed themselves, relying on whatever they could preserve through winter. Olives, dried legumes, chilies. Small peppers became a dietary staple, pickled, dried, ground into paste, worked into cured meats. The preservation instinct ran deep. The second wave of Italian immigration to Chicago, the wave that mattered for the sport pepper, arrived between 1880 and 1914. These were contadini, rural laborers from Calabria, Abruzzo, and Basilicata, people whose relationship to food was about survival and preservation. They settled into the Taylor Street neighborhood on the near west side, adjacent to Maxwell Street. What they brought was exactly what they knew: pepper cultivation, pickling traditions, and the habit of growing vegetables in whatever urban soil they could find. The home gardens of Italian immigrants on the near West Side likely supplied tomatoes and other fresh vegetables directly to Maxwell Street vendors. Sport peppers first gained notoriety in Chicago via the Mexican Pavilion at the 1893 World's Fair. Not the Italian Pavilion, the Mexican one. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition drew enormous crowds to Chicago's South Side. The Mexican food presentation introduced fairgoers to pickled peppers, of exactly the type that would later appear on hot dogs. At the same fair, two Austro-Hungarian Jewish immigrants named Emil Reichel and Sam Ladany set up an Austrian village stand selling kosher all-beef frankfurters. In 1894, they opened a storefront on Chicago's West Side and named it Vienna Beef. Two immigrant food traditions, the pickled pepper and the all-beef frankfurter, arrived at the same city through the same event within a year of each other. The World's Fair was a compressed preview of exactly the multicultural food collision that Maxwell Street would spend the next 40 years completing. Jewish bakeries on Maxwell Street introduced Chicagoans to poppy seed breads. The same poppy seed bun that would become the required base of the Chicago-style hot dog. The bun, the sausage, and the pepper all traced to separate immigrant communities whose paths crossed on these specific blocks. After 1920, the Great Migration brought African American families north in numbers that changed the neighborhood's demographics. By the 1930s and 1940s, the market had also become famous for blues musicians. The same density of displacement and ingenuity that made it a food laboratory made it a music laboratory. And then the Depression arrived, creating the sport pepper's permanent home. Not in a garden, not in an immigrant kitchen, on a hot dog bun, for a nickel. In 1929, a man named Abe Drexler set up a stand at the corner of Maxwell and Halsted. He was not a chef. He was a street vendor trying to make something out of nothing in the opening year of the Great Depression. Drexler sold what he called a Depression sandwich, a frankfurter on a bun loaded with mustard, pickle relish, onion, dill pickle, peppers, lettuce, tomato, with a side of French fries, all for 5 cents. When the New York Times food writer R.W. Apple visited decades later, he described it. Flukies, which claims to have invented the salad-laden dog on Maxwell Street in Depression-ridden 1929, when it sold for a nickel. Here's the receipt. The Depression dog didn't survive because it was cheap. It survived because it was dense. One frankfurter loaded with every vegetable a vendor could source from Italian gardens became a full meal. The economics of the topping pile were not accidental. They were the point. This was not abundance dressed as street food. This was scarcity made to look like abundance. The ingredients weren't just filling, they were available. Italian families growing produce in near West Side gardens sold their surplus at Maxwell Street. Chicago's North Side celery farms, neighborhoods like Lakeview, had farmed celery through the early 20th century, supplied celery salt. Jewish bakeries supplied poppy seed buns. Vienna Beef, already established on Halsted Avenue, supplied the sausage. The geography of a single Chicago neighborhood had inadvertently preloaded every ingredient of what would become a codified recipe. But why no ketchup? During the Depression, ketchup masked the flavor of low-quality meat. Vienna Beef's all-beef sausage was something to taste rather than hide. Depression-era vendors refusing ketchup were distinguishing their product, and that refusal hardened into civic identity. Vienna Beef formalized the Chicago 7 as the official toppings: mustard, neon relish, tomato, onion, a pickle spear, celery salt, and sport peppers. A Depression-era improvisation became a protected regional identity. Today, The Chicago area has more hot dog restaurants than McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King locations combined. A demographic fact about what this food became in this city. The Maxwell Street Market ran for nearly 150 years. It was closed in 1994, not because it had faded, but because the city of Chicago needed the land for expansion of the University of Illinois at Chicago. The blocks were demolished. A documentary about Maxwell Street premiered at the Chicago International Documentary Film Festival in 2007 and at Sundance in 2008, narrated by actor Joe Mantegna. By then, the original site was already gone. What the market generated was not easy to replace. It had transformed successive waves of immigrants, Irish, Jewish, Italian, African American, Mexican, into Chicagoans, and it had, in the specific compressed chemistry of its Depression-era food carts, assembled the Chicago-style hot dog from the overlapping produce of 5 different immigrant communities. Today, approximately 573,000 people in the Chicago metropolitan area identify as Italian American, the 3rd largest such community in the country. The Calabrian descendants, whose grandparents farmed peppers near Maxwell Street, no longer run vegetable carts. But the sport pepper persists, produced commercially and specified as a required topping by Vienna Beef's brand standards for every vendor that carries its products. The sport pepper remains the most invisible of the 7 toppings. It has no champion, no famous advocate. It's just there, on every authentic Chicago dog, carrying the small, preserved, brined heat of immigrant gardens that no longer exist on a Chicago map. So here is the answer the hook was pointing toward. The sport pepper is on the Chicago hot dog because the Chicago hot dog was assembled from poverty, geography, and immigrant collision at one street market during the worst economic crisis in American memory. It is Calabrian not because Calabrian cuisine conquered Chicago, but because the people who pickled those peppers were already there, growing and selling what they knew. When a man named Abe Drexler needed every vegetable he could get for a 5-cent meal. That is how a pepper from southern Italy became a civic requirement in the American Midwest. The Chicago-style hot dog was never designed. It was discovered from the overlapping traditions of Austro-Hungarian Jewish immigrants, Eastern European Jewish bakers, Italian gardeners, and a Mexican food presentation at an 1893 World's Fair. The smallest pepper on the plate carries the largest history, and there are other dishes in other cities that work exactly the same way. The question is whether you know where to look.